Hello, everyone. This will be the first interview that I've done on this channel, and I hope it is one of many. So I'd like to introduce our guest, Aiden, or aidenthevvitch on YouTube. I'll be appearing on Aiden's channel, so please check that out. Over there, we're going to be discussing Reconstructionism versus Neo-Paganism, and then over here, we're going to be discussing deity relationships. I'll link it up here when that is all. First, Aiden, tell us about yourself.
So hi, my name is Aiden. I practice a bunch of different things. Witchcraft obviously is a big part of that because my YouTube channel is Aidenthevvitch, or VVitch, however you want to say it. I have a background in Solomonic magic. A lot of more of the Christian mysticism side of things is where I started out with, but I've kind of shifted a lot more towards folk magic, witchcraft, a lot of traditions from the southern USA because that's where I'm from. I consider myself pagan, and yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so I guess we're just gonna jump right into it.
Yeah.
So I would say one of the first things, especially as a younger pagan, one of the first things that I ever came across with when talking about deities and deity relationships was the concept of working with versus worship. Something that you really can't get away from, and people often put those two against each other. I talked a bit about my thoughts on that in my Our Deities Advanced video, but my answer essentially was that I don't see there really being much of a difference between the two of them in common Hellenic polytheism, but I know that this changes sometimes when you look more at the witchcraft sphere. So I don't know what your thoughts are on the concept of working with versus worship.
Yeah, I have a lot of mixed thoughts on it. I kind of go back and forth on it. So personally, I think that the two are inherently intertwined, but they are different things at the same time, if that makes sense. Your worship part of the practice will be different from your working part of the practice, but they kind of go together. It's kind of hard to worship something without working with it too. I also just don't see a point in worshiping if you're not going to also interact with them on a deeper level than that.
So I guess for you, how do you define... I mean, I know you said you kind of see them as interchangeable, but you do see there being a slight difference. So what do you see the difference being between...
I see working with as more direct work, obviously. So invocations, spell work, so the actual work part of magic. Whereas worship is more dedication work, more devotional work, so adoration, prayers that don't necessarily ask for something, offerings obviously, and growing your relationship. Though obviously when you do spell work and invocations, you're growing your relationship at the same time, which is where the kind of overlap comes together.
Yeah, I also go back and forth on how I feel about those terms. I mean, I used to only use the term working with, mostly because of religious trauma hangups around the term worship.
Yeah.
But then I kind of ping-ponged, and then I started only using worship, but then it felt like it was kind of hard for me to communicate. The term that I started using, having praxis with, which praxis just kind of means practice. In the Hellenic polytheist kind of view, when you develop a relationship with the deity, you're developing charis with them, which is a reciprocal give and take. And it's also kind of this idea of building up praxis, building up a practice with them. That is something that I have personally started saying more because it felt more encompassing than the terms worship and working with. Because in the mystery cults of Hellenism, they had the concept of theurgy, which literally translates to God work. Now, this wasn't really done so much in the common religion, but it was often practiced by Hellenistic mystery cults, ceremonial magicians. You see it all the time in the Greek magical papyri, as well as in some of the Hecatean mystery cults as well. And in the PGM as well, you have the Hellenistic spells where some of them are even binding gods. I think there's one where they bind Kronos, which is very much not your typical worship. But also those things are not part of the common religion. So another concept that I often come across in discords, and I know this specifically comes across in a lot of general witchy discords, is, or even not on Witchblur back in the day, people talking about is there a number of deities or limit to deities? Because I often find people will ask, how many deities do you work with, worship, etc.? And I'm always just all of them. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are on the limit of deities.
Yeah, I see people ask about this all the time. Either how many deities do you work with, or how many deities can I work with? Am I working with too many, too little? I personally, this might have just been the Christian mysticism part of me. It's they're all the same guy, so why would you worry about how many you're working with? Also because in Christian mysticism, you're talking to tons of spirits.
Right.
So many spirits. So when I made the full switch over to like paganism, I never really had a problem being like, I'll just call them a bunch of different spirits to have a work done or to get to the spirit I'm trying to talk to and things like that. I think there's no limit, but if you're trying to have more intimate relationships with a deity, then you would probably want to not have like a ton. I'm not going to put like a number on it. Like think of like a close friend group. You're closest with these guys, but you talk to all these guys.
I think with a lot of these things that we're going to talk about, I think there's often like a fine line, and there's often like, I forget there's a term for it. It's like a curve almost. Oh, what is that called? Once you hit like this point, you think you're a genius.
Oh, Dunning-Kruger effect.
Dunning-Kruger, yeah. There's very much that thing. You're like, I don't know anything. So I think there is a point sometimes, you know, or I see people who are like, my patron is Loki, Freya, Athena, Hecate. And I'm just like, whoa, okay, we need to slow down. I don't want to say that there's a limit to start, but I think there's also a period of time where you're new to a practice and trying to jump in and say, I worship and work with 80 deities. Is not really sustainable. In Hellenism, there's often this idea of a hearth cult or a personal pantheon. And this was seen in families or even for individuals where individuals or families would have a closer relationship with a certain set of deities, right? The idea of the 12 Olympians is a myth. I'll get that out there. I'll probably have a video about that. It's called a dodecathon, so there would often be groups of 12 gods. So our Olympians are Athens dodecathon, but there's other city gods that they would have. Olympia would have a different dodecathon of gods that they were closest with. The same thing happens too with families and people. And you see this a lot in more like Hellenic polytheist discords where they will talk about deities that they have a specific personal relationship with. But it's not that you don't ever go outside of that, you know? Like just because I have a close relationship with Athena, Hermes, and Apollo doesn't mean that I'll never go to Zeus for anything. That was one thing that always kind of confused me, especially later on once I actually started thinking about this stuff more. Why would I go to Apollo for something that's in Hephaestus's domain? You know, like if something in my house is broken, I'm not going to pray to Apollo to help it get fixed speedily. Like that doesn't really make any sense.
No, I think it's also weirdly similar to the saints. What I was always taught was that like, yeah, God can do everything, but you should go to certain saints to get like specific jobs done because the idea being like, they'll talk to God to get done faster.
In some ways, it's kind of interesting. So Hellenism has the idea of epithets, which are certain aspects of certain gods. I'm not going to pray to Pallas Athena, it's like the more warlike Athena, if I need help studying, you know, I would pray to a different Athena, or I'm not gonna pray to Hermes Psychopompus when I want a message delivered. I've had this thought before because one of my housemates engages a bit with Christian and Catholic mysticism, and I kind of was like, oh, the saints are in some ways not exactly, they're almost like embodied epithets of God. Not exactly, but in some ways that's kind of how I see them kind of functioning sometimes.
That's a good thought, actually. I think I'll think about that more.
Speaking of mysticism and things not being cut and dry, one of the other concepts that you don't actually really see, I mean, I don't see it discussed, is the idea of hard versus soft polytheism.
Yeah.
So hard versus soft polytheism is very much a spectrum, one which people can slide up and down in the same religion and their same practice. I certainly have slid up and down. In short, hard polytheism is believing the gods are unique, individual persons separate from us and each other. And on the other hand, an extreme soft polytheist would see all of them as emanations of the subconscious, meaning Zeus, Odin, Jove would all be viewed as the same manifestation of the Sky Father, just called differently by different people. I find it interesting. I see in a lot of spaces this almost extreme hard polytheism. I'm not sure if you see. Yeah. I interestingly enough, I think I have a question here that's like, where do you identify in the spectrum? For me, I actually tend to lean more on the hard polytheist side, but like not extreme. But I find that there's this like extreme hard polytheist lean in a lot of communities that I find kind of odd. So for example, Aphrodite, Isis, Venus were all synced to get together at some point, or Aphrodite, Isis, Ishtar were all synced together at some point. And so I find it interesting when I see people who not only work cross pantheons, but also view them all as extremely separate individuals when in many ways historically they would have been synced, at least at some point. I think, yeah, syncing gods is almost something I never see.
Syncretism's like been a thing for a while. It's not a new concept. Like there's been syncretisms forever, pretty much.
Right.
Back to the Aphrodite example, it's very possible that Aphrodite came from the cult of Astarte. Then that became Venus, and then eventually we got Venus Urania being syncretized with the Virgin Mary. I personally am lean more soft. I wouldn't say so much so that the gods are all the exact same thing, manifestations of the same thing. I believe they're emanations of the same thing, but I don't believe that they are exactly the same. For example, with the Jove, Zeus, Odin example, they're individual enough that you can see them as different things, but they are coming from the same thing. The only thing that I am 100% hard polytheist about is Santissima Muerte, but that's mostly because her cult is like, she is her thing. If you syncretize her, she will not like that. And from personal experience, she will not like that.
I think where I realize kind of my own leanings on is when I look at Hermes and Mercury, right? Because Hermes and Mercury, I think, are one of the most heavily syncretized individuals. Like, I struggle a lot to even think of really the differences between them besides just expounding upon Mercury's cult and Roman period. I don't usually work with a lot of syncs necessarily across pantheons, meaning like I don't do like Aphrodite, Isis, Ishtar. Or, for example, like Artemis and Hecate are synced together in Hellenic polytheism. So sometimes I'll do inter-pantheon syncs. And a lot of that has to do, for me, with how I view culture. So in some ways, like, we give the gods certain aspects, or the gods reveal certain aspects of themselves to us through culture. Athena and Minerva are different, not necessarily because they're separate beings, but because the cultures surrounding them are different and are giving them different things. I don't know if that makes sense. It's so hard to explain.
That makes a lot of sense. I would even compare that again to like the saints, like Saint Bridget versus the goddess Bridget.
Mm-hmm.
They're basically the same thing. One's a saint with Catholic imagery around it. The other's a goddess with Irish imagery around it. Pre-Christian Irish imagery around it. Serve very similar purposes, but people will say they are completely different beings. I worked heavily with Mercury, still do, but whenever I say Mercury, I mean Thoth, Hermes, Mercury. They're all the same thing to me. Yeah, so the planet, it's Thoth, it's Hermes, it's Mercury, the god, they're all kind of just synced together into one for me under the name of Mercury.
And I do understand, I know people in my comments be like, they're totally different. Like, I do understand where that distinction comes from, but it's just kind of weird to me how heavily it's made. And I think hard, and the reason I bring up hard and soft polytheism when talking about deity relationships, because we're going to talk a little bit more about like deity interactions later. And I think this shows up a lot. I think a lot of hard polytheists, very, very hard polytheists, have this view of like deities being fully manifested with their own distinct personalities and tastes. Like, it almost humanizes them in a way that I don't identify with, whereas soft polytheists are, Zeus is not necessarily a distinct individual. Zeus is the sky. The sky is Zeus, more blending between the tangible world and the spiritual world. Okay, so I think we're going to start talking about types of deity relationships. And I have a couple here. So I have patrons/devotees, mother, father, humanized figures, casual relationships, priesthood, patrons/devotees. I included these things together. I think they're different, but I think they're related. Oftentimes, I don't think I can walk into a server, a deity chat in a server. You saw this all over Witchblur as well, without coming across the terms patrons, patroness, or matron. And people constantly asking, how do I find my patron? How do I find my patroness? There's some YouTube videos of like finding your patron god. It's very odd. Like, I actually came to the term patron on my own. I used to use the term patron describing my relationship with Apollo, except I didn't mean the way that people mean it today. Yeah. Like, people oftentimes mean it as a personal deity who is chosen you in a lot of ways. Like, this deity has chosen you and you have chosen them and you have the biggest bond with them, and they're almost like your god with a capital G in a lot of ways. Like, they are like the head of your personal pantheon. Whereas with me and Apollo, I use the term patron because I viewed him as the literal patron of my arts. not
Yeah.
as like a patron in the sense of being my main god. But then I was like, should I start using it? Because I started seeing other people use it. So I don't know what your thoughts are on the idea of patrons and matrons and patronesses.
We'll get into the conversation of matron and patroness, but patron to me has always been kind of like a weird thing. I've always said like, oh, Mercury and Chaos are my patron. Chaos as in the kind of my, not exactly, but essentially bastardized version of it taken from Greek mythology. I used to say that all the time, but I've kind of moved to saying I don't really see it that way anymore. I don't really see the idea of patrons being like, this is your sole deity who's like the highest deity or like your main deity. That's kind of like people have kind of made it out to be. It doesn't really make sense to me anymore, I guess. I follow a lot more with what you say, like they're the patron of my craft or the patron of this thing, then I work with them for that reason, which is actually, again, very similar to how the saints work, where they'll have like a patron saint, like Saint Bridges, patron saint of Ireland.
Saints are like patrons of certain aspects,
Yeah,
right?
there's a ton of saints, and they all have like a patronage over something.
Right. And like in Hellenism, there are like patron deities. So like Athena is the patron of Athens, or Hera and Argos. And like there is some discussion in classical Hellenism of certain people being devoted to certain deities. That's why I included devotee on this list, because I think they're
Yeah.
related, but they're not the same. Sappho, I would see as a devotee of Aphrodite. Like she was very devoted to Aphrodite and wrote a lot of stuff about Aphrodite, but it wasn't like she necessarily felt that Aphrodite chose her, or like Aphrodite was like this end all be all. And same with like Plutarch and Apollo. Plutarch was very devoted and loved Apollo a lot. Although Plutarch's a bit of a weird example for me to use, because in some ways, if you see Plutarch talking about the god, he's talking about Apollo. But that gets more in philosopher territory. And oftentimes that starts bleeding back into soft polytheism. The idea of patron, matron, patroness, etc. comes a lot heavily from Wicca,
Yes.
as we see it today. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. People who don't know, Wicca has the god and the goddess. And generally, the god and the goddess's names are not necessarily revealed to you, either unless you've been initiated into a specific coven or through, I don't know, various forms of self-initiation. And Wicca is also more of like a duotheistic religion. It's very soft polytheist. They kind of view a lot of like gods and goddesses as emanations of the god and the goddess. Generally, that's a general statement about Wicca.
Yeah, so I often see the idea of like matron goddess, patron god. That's like very obviously from Wicca.
Okay, so do we want to get into a little bit about the discourse around matron versus patroness? What are your personal thoughts on the term patroness versus matron for a feminine deity?
One thing that I have always held on to ever since my film study teacher told me this in my junior year of high school, it's actor, not actress. I've kind of carried that for everything at this point. It's patron, not patroness. It's priestess is a little weird because of historical context, but most other things I'll just drop the S.
I mean, like, I went to an acting school and we all referred to ourselves as actors, not actresses. I think sometimes people will like use actress to, like, if they're specifically talking about something that affects female identifying actors in Hollywood, they'll say actresses. Or people will call Sappho a poetess. And I think sometimes people use it for more archaic things. I also think a lot of people get kind of hung up on the term matron in certain ways. In some ways, by saying patroness, it sometimes feels almost like they're specifically trying to avoid the term matron.
Yeah.
And like, I understand why, because matron has like this kind of, I mean, matronly. But I don't know. I feel like sometimes by avoiding the term matron, and specifically thinking that that word is bad, ends up being in some ways more sexist than using the term patroness or patron. I think people get hung up on terms when they don't necessarily need to be.
Yeah, that happens a lot in the communities anyway.
Another thing that you see a lot in the community is people calling certain deities mother or father, using these humanized terms. And there's quite a bit of discussion around this that I see, where a lot of people feel very strongly one way or the other, where a lot of times people say, no, you absolutely can't call Zeus father. That's weird. That's humanizing him. But I personally don't have an issue with it, mostly because you see in Christianity calling God the Father, or I'm not Catholic myself, never been Catholic, but I know plenty of Catholics who call Mary mom.
Yeah.
Like my friend and I were in the Italian Catholic neighborhood during a festival, and my friend had a Mary bag. One woman was just like, "Good, love your mother, honey."
It's true. It's very true.
You see in historical Greece, like classical Greece, like people using it's called devotionalism, like these devotionalist terms and familial terms to refer to deities, especially Demeter or Zeus, for example. I really don't have an issue if people want to call Persephone their mom. Like I don't. I see it as something that happened historically.
I feel pretty similarly. Like, again, with the Catholic thing, everyone just calls Mary mom. If you ever go to a more Hispanic area, Mary's your mom. Like, just, that's it. There's no question about it. I don't see a problem, per se, when going over to paganism. I think there are certain times when people do it way too quickly. And I do think some people take it a little bit far. Like, it's one thing to be like, Hecate's my mom, and it's another thing to be like, I'm the child of Hecate born on Earth.
Right.
Which I've met someone IRL who has done that.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah, I think I agree with you in that, like, I think the issue arises when we forget that the deities aren't human. So, like, Hermes might be called the friend to mortals, but he's not the same as a mortal friend.
Yeah, exactly.
Which kind of leads me to my next point of casual versus intense relationships with deities. I feel like there's oftentimes this very heavy emphasis to have a very intense relationship with one or all of the deities that are part of your personal praxis. Like, I see this with Hecate, too, and I talked about this in my Hecate video, that, like, a lot of people are very much, like, you have to have a super intense relationship with Hecate. But if you look historically, classically, Hecate was not worshipped that intensely by anyone except for, like, people part of a mystery cult.
Yeah.
But I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot, like, again, to live with Hecate. I think you can definitely have a casual relationship with any spirit, really. But you don't need to, like, have a whole altar. You don't need to be, like, praying, like, 24/7 to a deity. You can just go to that deity in times of need, or you can have an altar to them, but they're not, like, the center of your life. And I think these more intense relationships are not a bad thing. I'm not going to say they're a bad thing, but they're not what everyone needs, if that makes sense.
Not everyone needs to have this nun-like life. I think sometimes there can be almost this fundamentalist view of paganism, because, like, so when I was a fundamentalist, they had this idea. I mean, it does say in the Bible that God will spit you out of his mouth if you're, like,
lukewarm. Yeah.
And they would, like, say this to us, basically being like, you have to be on fire for Jesus. But like, obviously you see that is not the case in the general Christian community. Like, a lot of people are casually Christian. Like, my grandparents go to church every Sunday, but they're not crying over the Bible every 5 seconds. And so I think sometimes people almost have this fundamentalist view of paganism in which, like, you have to be on fire for Apollo. And I'm just like, you can also just, like, go outside and, I don't know, go see a movie or something.
It's the idea of hyper intense relationships where you need to be on your knees crying before the gods, rending your garments. Pirates also, like, okay, you left this to just do the same thing with a different name. It's also just, that perception does come a lot from, I won't say it's entirely from the internet, but I will say that it does come from people on the internet, like, kind of glamorizing their relationships with spirits. People get this misconception that if you aren't having, like, these super intense, like, experiences, then you're not really doing the thing.
I think we're going to touch on that when we talk about deity interactions, because I certainly see this a lot. I once heard someone say that the people who are loudest about, like, their path are often the ones who are the most insecure. And I think there's something to that. That doesn't also just apply to, like, religion. That applies to a lot of things in life. So just, that's something that's important to keep that in mind. All right, so priests. This is another hot button topic, especially in the Hellenic polytheist community, at least right now. It comes in waves, the priest discourse. I am personally of the belief that priests primarily exist to help a community, an organized community. So the idea of a solitary priest does not make sense to me. I feel like there are other terms to describe that, like monk or nun.
Yeah, I was about to say that, exactly.
Yeah, that are not the same thing as a priest. And Aaliyah Kai, who's a popular Hellenic polytheist YouTuber, just did a video breaking down what priests actually were in ancient Greece, so I'll link that above because I don't have time to get into all the nitty-gritty of why I don't believe that there are modern priests. But that is the short of it. Generally, priests often go through a certain set of training, right? They go through training or in a lot of cases, they are elected. In ancient Greece, oftentimes it was an elected position or a position that you had in your family. And more often than not, the priests weren't really doing anything other than just taking care of the temple. They were often patrons of the temple once you funded them. They weren't really our modern idea of priests. I think there's this kind of obsession with priesthood that I think is kind of teeters on culty. Yeah. But I personally believe that unless you are in a specific group setting, that there are no modern priests, unless it's in a group or ritual setting.
Priest is always a community title. I think people forget entirely the community role and they just kind of want the status. It's all about status. If you're not doing something in the community, you don't have a community around you, you're not doing something for the community, then I don't see how you're a priest, even if you have this close relationship with the deity. I also think that we need to have more terms than just priest. And I think people kind of just default to that because there's other offices people can have, there's other forms of service that people can have relating to a civic spirit or group of spirits, but doesn't necessarily mean priesthood.
I also too think the idea of priests and priestesses and priestesses, etc., comes from Wicca again.
Yes,
again, I think that comes from Wicca because you always hear about someone's I'm a Wiccan priestess, and cool. That means they have a community because Wicca is a constructed religion that still exists today.
Yeah.
How does one communicate with the divine? I think people often understand the research stage of deity relationships, research on the internet, books, ask others, but a lot of people get hung up on how you actually communicate with the deity. A lot of times I see people, someone was asking in a Discord the other day where they're but how do offerings work? And I'm now you're asking the right question.
Yes.
I see there being a few primary ways of communicating with deities, and the two biggest ways I would say would be divination and prayer. I personally don't do a lot of divination, which people find kind of odd. I just don't feel the need to really. I don't really know how to explain how I don't feel the need to do divination. I just don't. So the way I primarily communicate with deities is prayer, and the basic Greek prayer kind of looked like calling in their specific epithets, so they know why you're coming to them. So you're going to pray to Athena Ergane for work-related stuff and not Pallas Athena. Then you name all the things that you've done before for them. So if I've ever burned incense for you, if I've ever made a votive offering for you, and then you mention all the things that they have done for you, you praise them for it, and then you make your request, and then you say what you will do when that request is fulfilled. So I guess an example would be Athena Ergane, if I've ever burned incense for you, if I have ever got you an image and dedicated it to you, hear my request. You have given me a stable job, you have helped me through a time of unemployment, and I thank you for that. I ask that you will help me in getting this raise. If I get this raise, I will pour out 3 glasses of wine in your name and dedicate a new statue. That was very simple, basic prayer structure. But obviously, prayers are not always that rigid. And I know you have a whole document on prayers as well that I love very much. I have it saved on my computer.
I've gotten a lot more loose with prayer as I've gone along, but the prayer structure that has always worked well for me whenever I need something to fall back on has been acts, adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Adoration, kind of similar to the part where you're saying for helping me get these things in the past or things you've done for me before. Kind of similar, but it can also apply to more of a cosmic level where, oh, emerald-headed Thoth, wise scribe of the gods, kind of going through that kind of adoration. Contrition is something that I've always gone back and forth on. It's I like it or not. But it's something where it's either asking for forgiveness or saying I've done this in the past and I am sorry for doing this and I hope that you can help me through this. So just something I think is more important than just kind of wallowing in misery for a whole section of your prayer. And then thanksgiving is thanking them Adoration and Thanksgiving can kind of go hand in hand. A lot of these are like very fluid as well. Like prayer can be very fluid. It can be more than just you saying a scripted thing as well. So like Thanksgiving would be like, thank you, Mercury, for helping me to get into the college that I've gotten into. Thank you, Mercury, for making me eloquent with my speech, making me eloquent in my writing, and things like that. And supplication is kind of the help me get this, please.
When you communicate with the deity with prayer, or a spirit with prayer, because I think sometimes people like feel like they're shouting into a void. So how do you feel that the deity communicates back with you?
I consider myself like a lot more lucky than other people, where I will actually hear the spirit in my mind, which takes discernment, and it's not there's a whole thing about that, but I will almost always hear the spirit, not physically, but in my mind, and it'll be more conversational. But before that, I have had images come to mind. Signs out in nature. I still get signs out in nature a lot, and people kind of misinterpret signs way too much as being this like grand thing.
Oh yeah, I mean, I guess for me, like one time there was something crazy going on with one of my friends, so I prayed to Athena. Now I'm losing my voice. I prayed to Athena for strength for them and for me, and to justice for the situation. And I went outside, and I live in a city, so owls don't like my area. It's very like crowded. And I heard an owl like shrieking out, and I was like, whoa, okay then. I was like, all right, I see you, okay. The reason I don't do divination is because when I do a ritual, I interpret everything in the ritual as part of the divination. So like people sometimes, this is why I don't really answer this when people ask me like, oh, I was doing a ritual to so-and-so and the candle went out, is that a sign? And people will jump to like mundane reasons, which is valid. For me personally, I would view that as a sign, just in the way that I do my rituals, and that I view everything as a sign.
In specific ritual contexts, everything has like a meaning and a purpose for being that way, but outside of that, it kind of becomes more like, this isn't like inherently a sign. It can be a bunch of different things. Also, I think people focus on signs from deities instead of omens, or the vast majority of other signs being not from deities.
Right, like I don't necessarily view a lot of signs from specific deities, except for like that owl was 100% like related
that's
to
definitely Athena.
But like, for example, I went through a period of doubt, and I'm still in like a lull. I go through a lull in the winter a lot of times.
Yeah.
And I was like very frustrated, and I was just like, just give me, anyone who was listening, I was like, yeah, just give me a sign that this is real, I guess, or like give me a sign to keep going. And then like literally the next day, someone who I know in my real life messaged me and was like, hey, I found your YouTube. I just want you to know that I'm also a Hellenic polytheist, and like they live in my area. And I was like, okay then. Alrighty then. It's like, I don't know who that's from, and it doesn't really matter. It's kind of a universe thing, I guess. Universe. I guess to touch on divination a little bit, I talked about this kind of, like the only method of divination besides like general like reading the signs of a ritual that I do is tarot. Primarily because I find that the imagery allows me to distance myself from things. Like, I have a personal vendetta against pendulums.
Same.
I used to use them a lot. I'll link Test Tubes and Cauldrons, so that we did, in which we talked about the psychophysiological movement. Basically, there was an article that suggests that actually it's not even our subconscious that is changing the direction of our pendulum. It is actually likely our conscious. I just find that their bias confirmation, the tool. Yeah, they also have a weird dubious history, likely related to spiritualism.
The only form of divination that I really do somewhat consistently is tarot. I also just kind of look for signs in nature whenever I'm for example, I'll ask like a question to whatever spirit or the universe TM, and I'll usually look for that sign throughout my day or in nature. This is a while back and it's kind of cringy, but whenever I was like, if this person is for me, give me like a red rose. If this person isn't for me, give me like a pink rose or something like that. I know it was a white rose, and then red rose if they're not for me. Yeah. So I remember that. But like, there's things like that where you can just ask for a sign and you will receive it somehow, some way. That's something that I've always kind of more depended on, because when I started out, I was like very anti-divination. Christian mysticism. Yeah. Oh, and bibliomancy. I did bibliomancy all the time.
Proverbs and Psalms, best things for
top tier. Top tier. Just looking for signs more in the mundane, I think, is better divination than trying to get like a pendulum.
Yeah, again, I think with signs, I saw this one funny meme where it was just like, everything is a sign, blah, blah, blah. And then it was just like, nothing is a sign, mundane of a magical. And then it was just like, everything is a sign.
That's literally how
like
it is, though. That's how it is.
It's so true. But I mean, I think you have to go through that period. I also, when it comes to beginners, even though like I do believe that only you can interpret what's a sign, I do think when you're starting out, you have to learn that discernment.
Yes.
You know, like Aphrodite's not trying to communicate with you at the subway station through a pigeon, generally. So like just because you see a flock of pigeons in the subway station doesn't mean Aphrodite's telling you something. It's just
right.
That's just where they live. But if you were like praying to Aphrodite, asking for something about your love life, and you go down to the subway station and a flock of pigeons flies directly into your face, like maybe that's something to look into. But
yeah,
you know, it's not like deities generally aren't randomly just like, hey, look at me.
I have a lot of thoughts on reaching out. If we can talk about that for like a quick second.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, like for me, I have only been reached out by 3 deities, and it's nothing like what anyone else compares it to. Yeah. Celine reached out to me. I know that because she talked to me. That's how I know that. That's how that happened. It wasn't because like I saw a vaguely related sign. It's like, no, she talked to me. And then I had Horus, a specific aspect of Horus syncretized with Ra, Heruraha, reached out to me because I had that name in my head all day, constantly. And I'd never heard that name before. I never knew it was, I knew it was related to Horus with the Heru part, but I didn't really know what it was about. And then I found out it's a bit more important than I thought it was. But it was never like I saw like a dove and therefore Aphrodite is my patron.
Oh my God, that happens so much. For me, I personally am of the belief that deities don't reach out to us without our subconscious reaching out to them. So like I used to believe that like Apollo reached out to me, but then I realized I was like, damn, Felicity, what was I doing? I was writing. I was playing music. Like I've done that my whole life.
Yeah.
Like, so it was almost like I was dancing in Apollo's domain, and then I was like, oh, like it was just like a click moment. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like I was randomly laying in bed one day and I like am a jock and like don't do anything related to Apollo and got this sign from Apollo. Like I do engage in the arts and I've like talked endlessly about the muse. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is deity interactions. When you look across the general occultosphere, you see a plethora of deity interactions. Some people are like, I went to Starbucks with my deity, or I watched anime with Hades. People talking about like physically seeing manifestations of deities. Then there's also terms that people use that I really don't like. People use terms like headblind. I hate that term.
Oh. Yeah.
I hate that term. It's also very ableist, and I'm just like, don't use it. It's very ableist. Yeah. I'm just going to come in here right now. The term headblind, very ableist. Don't use it. Just say that you can't see your deities. It's that simple.
Yeah.
Anyway, I also don't believe that it's a thing, but okay. That is another point. I'm going off the rails here at the end of my video.
Hot take time.
Hot take time. Thorn Mooney talked about this in one of her videos about being like a young Wiccan and going to these Wiccan conferences, and like that this has been a problem forever. She, for a while, didn't understand as a young Wiccan that, like, when people were saying that they saw the god and the goddess, that they weren't talking about literally seeing them. And she had to learn that. And now, in a lot of ways, people will be like, I literally see Hermes manifesting in my car. But first of all, press X for doubt. Second of all, I just feel like, again, this gets into what I was saying earlier about hard and soft polytheism. This feels like so hard polytheistic that it's almost, these deities are straight up walking around physical characters as opposed to gods. The amount of times I see people who are like, I don't physically see Loki dancing in my room to ABBA. Am I doing something wrong? I'm just like, what? First of all, what? Second of all, no. I have talked about this before. Like, I struggle with maladaptive daydreaming. That is just something that I struggle with. It has affected my spirituality in a lot of ways because you have to learn discernment. The mind is extremely powerful. If I wanted to close my eyes right now and envision that I was stroking a nice warm linen bed, I could physically feel what that felt like. That doesn't mean that there's an actual warm linen bed in front of me or in a spiritual way. That just means that my mind is real good.
Yeah.
At making things up. I'm often not as loud about this on my channel because my channel's more like info based, but I am very passionate about people dramatizing things and blowing things out of the water because it sends the wrong message.
It really does. And it's something that very much frustrates me to see, because it also takes away from like a lot of the more intense mystical experiences that someone might experience, because they casualize it and make it like, I don't know if that's the real word, but they casualize it. They make it like super like, oh, this happens all the time to me. Like, I see Persephone taking out the trash all the time. I've had someone say that before, actually.
Really? Oh, God. I've seen some things that are very similar. Like, gods answering emails. And I'm just why is that God?
I was talking about that last night with my friend.
Oh my God. I'm just like, why are these gods slaves to our late stage capitalist world? Why? If you look historically, like there are cases of people physically, like there was my friend who's Buddhist and ordained in his tradition. He gives this example of like there was some monk, I think I'm not really all that well versed, but he tells a story about how there was this monk who was like really prominent on his deathbed. He was like, oh yeah, I see like Buddhas and saints and spirits all around me, and then died. He was like, I just didn't mention it because it wasn't important.
Right.
And I think there's another one where someone's like, yeah, if you want to, you can see the Buddha in your mind's eye, but if you want to see a clearer image, go to the temple. It also just sounds exhausting. I'm like, God, to be that tuned in all the time?
Yeah.
Like, please, I want to watch my murder mystery shows in peace.
Right?
Yeah.
I also just don't know why you would bring your gods, like your gods, into watching TV with you.
I do understand it in the sense of I feel like people are very lonely. And especially a lot of people who are coming to paganism are coming from like a lot of intense or toxic religious communities.
Yeah. And
end up accidentally bringing over beliefs from those communities that they don't realize are from those communities. Persephone taking out the trash, it's very much similar to like stuff that I would hear when I was a fundamentalist.
Be very careful also, because I'm going to share a few mystical experiences. It's very frustrating because I have had like very intense mystical experiences. Also, it's like physical manifestations, like very different than what people think it is as well. With almost everything in the occult, it's always different than what you think it is. And within the Solomonic tradition, you're supposed to get physical manifestation. That's your goal. But it doesn't really happen the way people like to think it does. You are most likely not going to get this like super clear image of them, and you're also probably not going to get it just by sitting around. It's not going to just come to you when you're sitting down. Like, Persephone's not going to stand right there and take out, I don't have any trash in my room, but she's not going to take out my trash. I still can't get over that. That's like,
I can't get over that.
If you're evoking the example, the Archangel Michael, he might appear and you might see like this kind of form appear that is in different shades of light. It's hard to describe how that experience went, but I've had the Archangel Michael appear in an evocation in a ritual setting when I was supposed to be bringing him to physical appearance.
Not just like, here I am.
No.
I mean, like, things like that. There is like examples of that happening, and it's usually terrifying.
Yeah, it's extremely terrifying.
Like, I have had mystical dreams. Like, I've never had a conscious manifested experience, but like I had a dream once. I was like walking around and there was like something that was going on, and I was walking with Hera, Zeus, and Poseidon, and I knew it was them, but they were in human forms, and because of what was going on, in order to deal with it, they were like, we're going to become manifest like gods. And I knew in that moment I started running away with my back to them, because I knew that if they became manifest, that by viewing them in their like true form, I would die.
Yes. Yeah.
So like, is not hee ha ha.
That's why I say be not afraid.
Yeah. Huge part of mysticism is mystic anxiety.
Yes.
And by that I mean like struggling with the disconnect and struggling with doubt and struggling with wanting these things to happen. That is kind of a huge part of the mystic experience.
And it's not something that's sustainable for most people to be in that kind of state. I like a constant mystical state because
No. You go literally
yeah,
insane. And
you
I don't
would.
use that word lightly, but
No,
you
you
would
really should.
literally your brain would not be able to handle it.
Yeah, no, because I was trying to. This is like also why I left the church. I was trying to achieve that point because that's what I was kind of being told over and over again. Because I talked about my mystical experiences in church a few times, and they were like, "Oh, this is really good. You should keep pursuing this. You should keep pursuing this. You should keep pursuing this until your mind unravels." It's not sustainable. It's not healthy for most people. If you're not a devoted religious person, like you're living the religious life, you are not going to be able to sustain it. And I think trying to say that you should be striving for seeing these gods all the time, having these shopping with Apollo experiences all the time, it's not sustainable. It's also probably not going to ever happen, but
Yeah, so I guess to wrap this up, so we have time for your video as
yeah.
well. I could literally endlessly talk about this.
Oh,
I stayed up
same.
very late ranting about this with one of my housemates. So basically, like, all this to say, like, I don't want people to feel like I'm quote unquote invalidating their experiences. I don't mean to do that. But I want to encourage people to use discernment.
Yes.
As someone who has had maladaptive daydreaming ruin my life for many years, you should use discernment. Try disengage. If you feel that this is actually happening, try disengaging for a while and say, hey, Apollo, can you not like be here constantly? And if Apollo doesn't go away, it's likely your brain. Maladaptive daydreaming is an aspect often of like ADHD and obsessive compulsive disorder, and that like you have to kind of ruminate on these things. It's very hard. And I spent many years like disengaging and like meditating, specifically doing certain kinds of meditations that are like thought interrupting. No one has the answers except for you, but I also think you should not immediately jump to the defensive if people question certain things, because immediately jumping to the defensive is often a sign of a lack of confidence in certain experiences, which I think can be indicative of maybe some discernment and some time away. Just because you don't see Apollo even in your mind's eye, like that doesn't mean that you're not having any experiences. And like, for the love of all that is holy, stop saying head blind. Stop it. Stop it. It doesn't mean that something's wrong with you, and that's just normal. That just means that you're having a
Yeah.
normal experience. You shouldn't be seeing gods all the time. Deity interactions and deity relationships are a lot quieter than I think people want to believe. It's not like you are suddenly going to have these grand adventures. Like, it's not a fantasy novel. It's life. You know, you have to find a way to integrate it into your life and find a way to make it sustainable.
Mental health always comes first. If you aren't able to sustain your relationships, the gods will understand. That's a big thing. So the gods will understand. If they aren't understanding, they're probably not the gods. And you also should always use discernment. Make sure that you are understanding what experiences you're having, why you're having them, when to, again, disengage, when to take some time away from things and take more time for yourself. You don't need to always be doing witchcraft, paganism, mysticism, whatever. You just need to do it for you, for your life, because you're the one living it.
Alrighty then. Well, thank you so much, Aiden, for coming on my channel. And again, folks, please check out our discussion on their channel where we'll be talking about Reconstructionism versus neo-paganism. So it's sure to be interesting. So go ahead and check that out. And thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments or things that you'd like to add, make sure to pop them down below and let me know if you'd like to see more interviews, because I think this is fun. It's a lot looser for me, a lot less pressure for me, because I get to not have to do so much research. But anyway, thank you so much, and I'll see everyone in about 2 weeks then. All right. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.